The longer that I'm in this hobby for, the more I want most of my tanks to just be ones that have a halfway decent aquascape and that don't involve me having to worry or be stressed out about algae issues or, you know, how many water changes do I need to do to this thing to solve this problem. I just want as many of them as possible to basically be on autopilot. Don't get me wrong, I still like to get my hands in a fish tank, like probably more than most, but I just don't want it to be like a life or death situation as far as maintenance goes. And I think that's what most people want to have their fish tank be, is one that isn't stressing them out, one that doesn't require a super ton of work to look good and to prevent problems. So I think there's 4 or 5 main takeaways that we can pull from this aquarium that we'll go over today that can help you get to that point. Before we start though, I've carved out a little bit of space to work here. We're in the middle of a big remodel of the space. We're gonna turn this place into like an actual fish room. There's just a quick little shot of it. So we're talking about this tank today. Quick stats on the tank before we get started, because I always get the questions. This is a 6-foot water box tank. I can't remember exactly what the nomenclature of it is, but it holds roughly like 170 gallons. I'm using 2 6-foot LEDs. They're Current USA. You know, they don't really make a lot of 6-foot LED lights. They're either super cheap and crappy, or, you know, you have to do something else. So I felt like the Current lights sat kind of in the middle, and they work out great. You know, they're perfect for what I use it for. Lighting is going to be important to this whole thing. The substrate is a ton of UN Contra soil. It's the brown stuff. It hides mulm really well. That's, in kind of hindsight, one of the reasons why I decided to use it. It is a type of soil that a lot of, you know, the aquascaper dudes use, and I've used for a bunch of years. Works good at growing plants. And I think with this stuff in particular, we laced it with some laterite clay to kind of boost the iron in it. The tree trunks that we simulated in here is just cork bark. It's, you know, real stuff. It's not faux material. And these pieces have been submerged for, I think, a total of like 2.5, maybe almost 3 years, or maybe a little bit less than that. There hasn't been a ton of decomposition with them, and you know, I'm actually kind of surprised at how well they've held up over the years. This was something that I'd seen a little bit like people do, but not like this, not at this scale, but overall it's worked out pretty good for me. These pieces are silicone to the bottom of like an egg crate that sits underneath the substrate. That's how we hold those on. I have a build video for this whole tank that you can check out if you're super interested in it. Other than that, it's all things that aren't super important to the whole build of it. So like the filtration, you know, just any canister filter would work. We're using an old Awaza canister. I think that's it as far as equipment goes. As far as livestock and things in the tank, we have these really cool albino millennium rainbow fish. I love these things. They're just like the perfect pop of color of red. I just think they're super beautiful. They really stand out in this tank with the mostly green and brown. That's why I picked them. And then we have a few rummy nose tetras. Can't really remember how many exactly we have, but I think we started out with like 40 of them, and we probably have close to that. The tank's looking a little cloudy right now, which it usually doesn't. It's super clear pretty much all the time. I got in here and did some B-roll footage, kind of picking some stuff up. You'll see later in this video, but for the most part, don't really do hardly anything to this tank. Really infrequent with the water changes. I could probably count on 2 hands in the span of 1.5 years or so that it's been set up that I've ever done them. It's just like whenever I get a random wild hair and decide to do one. The nitrogen doesn't build up in this aquarium. It's undetectable pretty much all the time. And it's just a tank that I don't have to worry about. I don't have to think about like, oh, is that issue gonna turn into a bigger one? It's just never on my mind, other than just thinking about it being awesome. But how do we do it? That's what you probably want to know. So I think, you know, there's a lot of ways to do it. This is how I did it with this tank. So the first piece of advice, I guess, at least when it comes to this tank, is make very few changes to the environment. So it's really easy, especially when you first get involved in the hobby, or maybe you're in a situation where you only have one tank. You really want to get in there, you want to change plants around, you want to move big pieces of hardscape, you want to do a lot of just rescapes. And I think, hey, if it's time to do a rescape on your tank, it's time to do a rescape. But you definitely don't want to be in there like every week doing big things like pulling plants out of the substrate, or adding things like big rocks that are going to be nestled in there and messing with the microbiology of your system. Some of you might remember, if you've been following for a long time, I used to be a microbiologist. That's why I got into this hobby in the first place. And while I was going through all my years of schooling, you know, I learned so much about microbial ecology and all this stuff that's going on down here in the substrate in particular. Every time you get in here and you move things around, you're disturbing a microbial community that's working together to do a bunch of different jobs. I think of the substrate as kind of like the human gut. You know, there's trillions of bacteria and organisms in here that are all super important for the overall health of the greater thing that it's a part of. And we all know that when you mess with your gut, you eat some weird food or, do something funny, then it can have some systemic effects on your body or, in this case, the rest of the aquarium. That's how I like to think of it. These layers that form down here on the substrate and the invisible biofilms that are on the plants and on the hardscape in your aquarium probably do more than even I think they do. So every time you get in here and you disrupt things or move things or rub things, you're definitely altering a little bit of the tank. Now, something like that isn't going to cause a make or break shift in your aquarium, but you can imagine getting down here and pulling out most of, if not all of the dwarf sage, replanting with something new. We're really getting down there and we're disturbing a lot more of the overall surface area of our tank, and thus the microbes that are probably making it a lot safer and balanced for the whole system. And that's just making changes from like a physical standpoint, not to mention things like, changing the lighting in any way, like just turning it up 10%, the effect that that can have, making big dramatic shifts to the livestock. Like if we came in here and we put in 80 more rummy nose tetras, like that would definitely have an impact, and it could be something that results in, us starting to see nitrogen build up in the tank. More nitrogen, more phosphate. That could mean the introduction of a new type of algae that can then take advantage of that situation. So the more we can try and not make big dramatic changes, or even ones that seem subtle to us but do have a big impact on the tank, is going to really help the longevity and the balance of the system that you're taking care of. And look, I totally get it. In the first couple of months that your aquarium is now a thing, like you're gonna probably have to make some changes. You're gonna have to make modifications to the lighting, based on what your plants are doing, or, the algae level in your tank. You're probably gonna have to do more water changes than you would normally. So I get it from that perspective, and definitely in the early stages, those big changes are sometimes things that you just have to do. There's no right or wrong answer here, and it's hard to give a proper prescription for what you should do. A lot of it just comes from feel and from doing this so many times, but sometimes you just have to let things play out a little bit and be patient. Even though your tank is looking a little wonky or you're having the beginnings of an issue, all you can do is your best, and nobody has the correct answer for how you should handle any issue that arises. The second big tip, I guess, that I would give to most people is regarding lighting and keeping it as low as you possibly can. There's always going to be exceptions to this, particularly for people that are trying to grow like really high-tech plants and people using CO2, but I think for the most part, most of us overlight our tanks. I couldn't even begin to tell you like what setting these lights are on. They've just been the way they have been for literally the whole time this tank was set up at my old house, and here I haven't touched them once, but I would bet they are not on 100%. And despite the fact that we're having some kind of like stunted growth down here in the dwarf sage, you can tell because it's growing so tall and it hasn't like really spread out that much. It's just a situation where it hasn't caused any algae even up at the top of the water here. So a key indicator of an issue would be like a lot of hair algae growing up out of parts right here where the lighting's obviously the highest, right underneath the fixture and right below the water level. But we don't see that. So that's not something that I'm willing to gamble with, like turning the lights up 25% maybe to try and get the growth out of this plant be a little bit better isn't worth the risk of potentially having more work to do as far as algae removal. And everybody's aquarium is going to be different, right? Like it depends on so many things. I can't narrow it down just for you, but for me with this tank, with the height of it, with the plants that I picked out, with everything about it, this lower level of light has just seemed to work perfect for me. And I'm happy with the kind of like double-edged sword of the low light. If you're having issues with algae and you can't seem to figure out what it is, you've been doing a bunch of water changes, you can't detect any nitrogen or phosphate in your water, but you're still having problems, go to your lights. Turn your lights down to like 15%. Just humor me. I know that might sound a little weird, but just do it. Some of my most successful tanks were ones that I took the lighting down way past where I thought it should be for even, the type of plant that was in the tank or whatever. Turns out that plant was doing just fine. Even with the lighting down way low, the algae problems basically went to nothing. That taught me a lot. It's a little counterintuitive because, plants need light to grow, and if they're growing, they're consuming nutrients that should help with the algae, but that's not always the case because algae is robust too. Algae and plants can consume levels of nitrogen and phosphorus and other things that we can't detect because they're just that good at it. So just because you're getting zeros on a test kit doesn't mean that there isn't some other factor that's influencing its ability to grow. I'm not saying to do like a blackout or anything, that's a whole different story for algae control, but when it comes to, you know, wanting to keep your plants alive and wanting to kind of reframe your system, try turning those lights down way super low, and I think you're gonna have a better time with it than you might be thinking right now. And furthermore, you know, in this tank, one of the things that I did before I started filming was I pulled a bunch of this Sylvinia minima out of the top. Like, it was totally covering the top of the tank, which actually goes against my first piece of advice, which is, you know, don't be making big changes, because that is definitely a big change, specifically in the lighting department, right? And the nutrient removal sponge capabilities of this plant. So even though we did make a big change like that, while it is a little bit of a gamble, I'm confident that it's not going to bring about any new issues, mostly because I've done it several times before without any bad repercussions. These are all just little things that you'll learn about your tank if you have it set up for long enough to learn them. And so that kind of ties into the whole patience thing, which isn't going to be one of the tips. Don't worry. That's patience is always a part of having an aquarium and getting one to be like in a balanced situation like this. But yeah, it's definitely an important one. Kind of tying into a few of the things that we talked about, I think another big one is just making the right selections on the plants that you put in your fish tank, because that can have more of an impact than you probably think. It can have an impact on the amount of changes you have to make. For example, even doing something like trimming a ton of plants in your aquarium can have an effect on what's taking place in it as far as nutrient consumption goes. So you can imagine you had like a Dutch style tank, you do a big trim, you cut down like, you know, 90% of the plants. They're gonna have a little period of where they need to sort of reset themselves before they start to uptake nutrients again and start doing what you want them to. And during that period, you could have some issues. My goal is to not make anybody paranoid about trimming plants or anything like that. I just wanted to bring attention to the fact that it is a change that could have a little bit of an impact on your tank. Don't get me wrong, I still think that aggressive, fast-growing plants are a really good way to help prevent problems and algae in an aquarium, so don't think that I meant the opposite of that. Sorry if I made that a little confusing. But sort of that cycle of things changing in the aquarium, the nutrient demand changing, that I think isn't maybe always the best thing. It's hard to say that it isn't good to have plants be growing. Like, I realize what I'm saying is kind of weird, but I think you get what I'm trying to say. Trying to keep things as static as possible can be good. It can also be bad, right? Like, nothing is black and white here. There is no line in the sand that you do or don't want to cross. But for example, in this aquarium, you know, the Java fern just sort of slowly grows. The dwarf sage down here just sort of slowly grows too. The only plant that is kind of breaking the rules is our big floating plant. In the case of this tank, because it's so robust in other places, it doesn't seem to alter the environment all that much. And so if this was the early stages of a tank with one where a substrate isn't super developed and everything else super happy, then that could be an issue, but now it's not. This can be kind of a tough thing though, because selecting plants isn't always the easiest thing in the world. You don't know exactly what plants are gonna work best in the particular scape that you're setting up, but I'm sure you can imagine the struggles we'd have if we put a bunch of plants in here that just ended up dying over time, producing more nutrients into the water column and making it just that much more difficult to get the autopilot tank that doesn't have a lot of problems that we want to have. Sometimes you got to mess around with plants and find the ones that you know will grow good in your water. So this is all part of the learning experience that, you know, I've had 10 years to figure it out. So I have the plants that I like and that I know do good in my water and that I have more confidence in that I know are going to do well for me. Only time will teach you that though, which is kind of a bummer. I know that might be not what you want to hear, but it's the truth. The whole gist of this video is mostly the consistency factor, right? So even with things like feeding a really good food and being consistent with it, feeding, you know, roughly the same amount to your fish every day is always a good idea. Observe your fish while they eat, try and prevent, you know, as much from hitting the floor as possible. That's kind of a good judge of if you're feeding too much. Obviously you know, only feed your fish as much as they can eat in 2 minutes or whatever everybody says. I just try and sprinkle on an amount and observe the fish for a minute or so, make sure everybody's looking like they're eating and, you know, a dramatic amount isn't hitting the ground. It's okay if a little bit does. It's not going to hurt anything. It's just going to feed bacteria. And you know, a tank like this, I only feed it once a day, maybe. Sometimes I skip a day. Every once in a while, I'll let try not to get wet when you feed them legit fish food, man. Every couple of months, I try and let my system go on a little bit of a fast. So I'll go like 4 or 5 days without feeding. I think that's a beneficial thing. I don't really have any proof to that, but it's just something that I do that I like to think has a little bit of an impact. Gives the fish a little bit of a time to like engage with their primal selves and go find some food around the tank. And you know, if you have a bunch of algae eaters in your aquarium, like this big chunky guy back here, he just swims away. He's a scaredy cat, but you know, that might prompt him to go do a little bit of the job he's supposed to do, and mostly just keep things consistent. So if I were to come in here and start dumping in twice as much food, twice as much, then that could have an impact on, you know, the bio load, right? Like fish producing more waste than they normally do. Then that triggers microbial changes that maybe creates an opportunity for algae to pop up. You never know. I think that feeding and light output are the two biggest things that, you know, people can mess up on as far as having too much of, that then have the biggest ramifications. So consistency, I think is super important, especially in those two categories. There are some drawbacks to the autopilot tank, or one that you don't have to do very much of any work to. And so I think it's important that we talk about that before we wrap things up. This is only an issue if it really bugs you and or you're going to be making some changes to your aquarium, and that is just the buildup of detritus. So like in this tank right here, you can see some pockets where there's some heavy mulm and junk sitting down here in the substrate. You probably already noticed it when I was panning around down here. And that just comes from the fact that I haven't stuck a siphon in this aquarium at all in a super long time. So not the most sightly thing ever, but it's also not really like a negative for the tank. It's not an issue from a, hey, nitrogen's gonna build up in here from that or be a problem point of view, but it is an issue as far as like wanting to get in here and do anything, right? So even when I was pulling out plants in here, I was moving water around, you know, that had even an influence on some of this stuff down here. Going through with the magnet scraper can even kick stuff up, just like getting the bottom of the tank. You know, we have particulate floating up. That's not really like a bad thing. Like it's not clogging up our filter or causing any systemic issues in the aquarium, but it is kind of annoying. Like if I were to go down here and move some plants, like having that mulm be off the surface at least would be a little beneficial. And you know, if this substrate was black or if it was white, right? Like if this was a white sand bottom tank, it would look super gross. So that is something that will happen pretty much no matter what. Again, super glad that I picked this brown substrate because it hides it so well. Like if you take a step back, you can't even tell it's there. Something else that's interesting that I wanted to point out relative to not really doing any maintenance is like there's some cyanobacteria on some of this dwarf sage. There's a little bit there too on that plant. And if we look way back, there's a little bit there. For the most part, these stems are all healthy and they're growing good and there isn't any of that issue. I could go in there and I could do a treatment for cyano. I could rub it off the leaves. I could do anything, right? I could start doing big water changes to try and get it to not be happy and then disappear. But I haven't done any of those things, and this stuff has been here on these handful of leaves of dwarf sage for probably 2 or 3 months. It hasn't escalated itself. It hasn't become a problem where it's like growing over the substrate and, you know, to the point where I would want to intervene with it. So I just let it do its thing. I just let it chill. I let it coexist with the system, because while it is something that could turn into a problem, it hasn't for me, and I don't think it's going to. So I don't know, man, kind of controversial fish tank opinions here with all that stuff. I hope this video wasn't too confusing. I know we talked about a few different things that sort of seemed like they were a little maybe counterintuitive or sort of double-edged sword-y, I think that's the term. Moral of the story, nobody can give you the right answer for what you should do for your fish tank. All anybody can do is try and give you advice or, you know, what they would do. And so that's all this video was just showing you this tank and how I got it to be this way and how I've been able to maintain it like that for this long. And who knows, maybe in another year, it will look totally like a disaster and I will be proven wrong, but I don't think I will. I think we're gonna keep this tank pretty much the same and we're gonna continue to just watch things slowly develop in it. And that just makes me really happy. And that's what you should do with your fish tank, is do whatever makes you really happy.